Well, I have 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started so we can give Art all his full time. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. And I know we just had turkey sandwiches, but don't snore, okay, if you fall asleep. Art's actually been in industry for over 25 years in oil and gas and all other sorts of industry. And he told me that when he started with CMI, he thought he was just going to be working with it for 6 months. It's been 2 years later, and he's still working with it. So we're ready for your information, Art. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Introduction, my name is Art Werkenthin. I am with RISC Incorporated. We are an LMS provider. I've been working with LMSs for over 25 years. I wrote my first LMS when I used to live in Chicago and work for Amoco Oil Company in their big white tower downtown. And I'm still doing it all these years later. It's just more of a hobby than anything else. It became my job. I don't know how much of you are very familiar with xAPI or TinCan, but I'll go over a little bit of history of that. We were an early adopter of this new spec put out by ADL, who also put out SCORM, back in the 0.9 version, which was, I think, in 2012, something like that. And we were the first LMS to be compliant with the actual spec once it was released. We released our own version, a new version of the LMS, about a week after the spec came out in compliance with xAPI. But more importantly, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm a member of the CMI Specification Committee. It's now the ADL Committee. It used to be the AICC Committee, and I'll talk about some of that history, and that's my contact information, but it'll come up again at the end, so don't worry about writing it down if you're interested. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at first the history of how an LMS has communicated with content and go through all the specs and the background on that. If you're not familiar with how AICC or SCORM came to be and how we got to xAPI, we'll talk about that. We're going to look at the current most popular spec, which is SCORM, either in the 2001 or 2004 version. And why we think it needs to be replaced. Why are we going through all this specification development? Why is ADL investing money? Why have I invested 2 years of my life in getting the spec done in order to replace SCORM? And we'll talk about xAPI or TinCan, as you may have heard it called. They're exactly the same thing. Technically, they're a little bit different, but the specs are identical. And it's xAPI a good basis on which we can build a new SCORM, and we'll see why it is. And then we'll look at what is CMI5, what is the specification that's going to be coming out very soon now, and what are the goals and the benefits of CMI5 over a SCORM or over an AICC. Looking at the history first, the original LMS to content communication standard was called AICC, developed by Boeing and several other companies in the aviation industry. And the idea was that you would be able to launch an e-learning module from an LMS and get results back. That was at its core what the spec was intended to do. And it started off in 1993 in a DOS. Remember DOS? Anybody old enough to have used DOS? Back then, we had to, when you wanted to launch a module, the LMS wrote a little file somewhere on the drive of the user. And then when the content opened up, it read that file. And then it wanted to communicate back with the LMS. It wrote back to the file, and then the LMS got that and could read the file. And that's how we started off with file-based communication. Ultimately, they came out with a newer version in '96, I believe, where it would work on this newfangled thing that Al Gore invented called the internet. And we were able to actually pass things back and forth in a live manner using an HTTP request or a web request over the incredible internet. Then along came ADL, which is a offshoot of the Department of Defense in the United States. It's funded mostly by the Department of Defense in order to develop new ways of learning for the military. And AICC was a little bit incomplete for them. There wasn't enough data being captured. They needed something to where if they developed a module for the Army and the Marines were using a different learning management system, they wanted those two things to be able to communicate. So it would work in their learning management system, it would work in the Navy's learning management system, it would work in anybody's learning management system, based on something called shareable content objects. RISC came out in 2001, the development started, I believe, in 1999, and it is actually based on AICC. A lot of the terms that you see in SCORM come from the original AICC, and the people who worked on AICC transferred all that material to ADL and worked with them to develop this new spec. It was revised quite substantially in 2004, and it hasn't been touched since then. So a lot of changes have occurred in technology since then. We have, for example, mobile phones, smartphones, we have tablets, we have people who want to take learning offline, people who want to consume learning on their mobile phones. SCORM is absolutely not designed for that. SCORM is designed for browser-based content launched from a browser-based LMS, and that's it. Now, people have developed various workarounds, but that's basically how it's supposed to work. Then ADL looked at this. They commissioned a project, funded a company called Rusticy Software, and the project was called Tin Can. And the purpose of the project was to look at SCORM, figure out all the things that people absolutely hated about SCORM, what was wrong with it, document it, and come up with recommendations for developing a new specification. That specification ultimately, when it was approved and adopted, became xAPI, or the Experience API. So if you hear people using Tin Can and xAPI, they're really the same thing. Now, Tin Can was supposed to be just the project, but people got used to using the name, so they call the spec Tin Can, or they call it xAPI, exactly the same thing. So it's caused some confusion in the market, but they're identical. SCORM. When SCORM came out, it was intended to be LMS to training content communication, like all of these specs, but it was designed for the desktop and designed for the browser. It uses a common packaging mechanism. You zip up a SCORM file. If you export it from Captivate or any of your content development tools, Lectora, it exports a zip file that you can then copy over to your LMS, and you can import it. And it all just kind of works, mostly. It's also a common launching mechanism. Everybody knows when you launch a SCORM module from a browser, you usually get 2, 3, 4. I've seen as many as 5 windows open from a SCORM module, which is actually one of the things people don't like about it. There's some problems with SCORM. One, the content has to reside in the same domain as the learning management system. Now, what does that mean? Well, for all practical purposes, it means on the same web server. So your LMS runs on a web server, your content runs on the exact same web server. So when you import it, it gets imported to a path that the LMS chooses, and then the LMS launches it from that path. And that's because it uses what's called relative URLs. So it doesn't have a full web address like www.amazon.com. It just has the rest of that, all the stuff that's after it. And the first part becomes the LMS. So if you see a SCORM module launch, it's your LMS's domain / whatever the actual content is. So it all has to be in the same place. What's bad about that? Well, one, you've got your LMS and your content running on the same server, you need a lot of bandwidth. All of your content is running from that exact same web server. So if you have lots of users, you're chewing up a lot of bandwidth launching content. And there's no way to put that content anywhere else using the SCORM spec. Now, people have workarounds for that, but they are workarounds, and they are not spec, and they are not interoperable. So it might work in one LMS and not work in another LMS. So we've lost interoperability once we deviate from the spec.
And it might work now, but 6 months from now, it could just randomly break.
Right. Exactly. Anybody ever looked at the SCORM spec? If you printed it out, it's about this tall. The SCORM spec and all of its associated addendums and documentation is over 4,000 pages long. It's extremely complicated. Very few people can figure it out. That's been very good for some vendors that will sell you a SCORM integration engine. Not so good for everybody else who wants to build something different.
What's CDN?
Oh, good question. Thank you. CDN is a content distribution network. What that means is if I want to have content and I want it to launch very quickly from Australia as well as from the United States, I can put it on a content distribution network, and when somebody in Australia opens it up locally in Australia. When somebody in the United States opens it up locally in the United States. Google has one. For example, if you hit Google in Australia, you type in google.com, it doesn't come to the United States. It goes to Australia. So that's what a content distribution is. Thank you for pointing out that I forgot to mention that. The other problem with SCORM is that the content has to run in a browser. So no mobile apps, no offline players, although some do exist, but again, they're non-spec. They're something that somebody has developed to solve a particular need, and they don't guarantee interoperability with other content. And I say yet because there's been an effort underway at ADL for many years to develop a mobile SCORM. But it isn't there yet, and ADL doesn't really have funding to improve SCORM and advance it, so I wouldn't count on that spec changing any, especially now that CMI5 is going to come out. SCORM is also easily hacked. I can take your SCORM module and guarantee that I get 100 on anything you have in there. It's just scripts. Anybody who knows a little bit of programming can hack into your SCORM module and send in whatever score they want to give themselves. Anybody who's a little bit technical could figure that out. It's not hard at all. And on and on and on. There's actually documents that are several hundred pages on the ADL website, which I'll give at the end, that you can go read about all the different problems that the Tin Can project found with SCORM. It's quite extensive. So, along comes the Experience API, or Tin Can, if you want to call it by that. Doesn't it fix all of that? Wasn't that the goal, to repair SCORM? Well, sort of. There's a lot more to the ADL project than just xAPI to replace SCORM. And it's only one piece of the new architecture that they're developing. Really, xAPI is two things. It is a communication method for how we're going to talk across the internet. So how content is going to talk to a learning record store, or LRS, which is different from an LMS. And all these things that are on this slide are things that your LMS might do, or things that SCORM might do with your LMS. Sequencing, for example, in the middle. That's something that SCORM does. xAPI has no sequencing rules in it whatsoever. Scheduling of classes you might do in your LMS. xAPI, you can't put scheduled data into it. It's actually against the spec. It's always historical information. Assessment. You can record test results in the Experience API, and a lot of people do, but you can't record test questions. You can't have an itemized bank of test questions that you're going to deliver. So Experience API, all these different things that your LMS and combined with SCORM can do for you, all the xAPI does is store results and define a communication layer between content and that record store. So we need something else to really replace SCORM. The benefits of using xAPI, though, because it is the basis of the CMI5 spec, the new SCORM is based on xAPI, is that learning can be recorded wherever it occurs. So mobile, gaming, simulations, social networks, all of that can write to an xAPI learning record store. Learning content in xAPI doesn't have to be in a browser. For example, we have a PDF annotator that Float developed for us that people can make annotations on an iPad in a PDF, and those annotations get written to our learning record store. So now we've gotten way away from SCORM. It's not even really training, it's just documentation, and we're recording the fact that people are annotating things in the learning record store, and we've gotten completely away from the browser. You can have non-browser based learning, such as the mobile app I just mentioned. Social networking, you could have a networking site where people ask questions of your instructors. Maybe you have chat rooms. Maybe you have Tapestry, which is a float app that does chat and forums and discussion groups along different threads, and it writes to the Experience API record store. So social networking among your employees can be recorded in the Learning Record Store, which you couldn't do with SCORM. Gaming and simulations is another area. I'm actually working with a company right now that they're building a simulator that will write to the Experience API record store. So all the activities that somebody might take in a simulator, say a simulator, in this case, of docking a ship that's coming in from overseas. Every action they take in bringing that ship to shore on the simulator can be recorded in the LRS and played back, and an instructor can look at that and see what actions the captain of the ship took. Another advantage of xAPI is because it doesn't depend upon the location of the content, the learning can be on one of those distributed networks. So you could have a content module like posted in the App Store, everybody can download it, and they can download it from a location that's nearest them. If they're taking it online, it can be loaded to them from a server that's close to them for performance and not chew up all of your bandwidth on your primary server. xAPI is also much more current technology than SCORM. Like I said, SCORM can be easily hacked because it is an old, unsecure technology. Your IT folks would know what this means, but this is a very common way for developing applications today. It's the most common way going on the internet. So xAPI adopted that, just uses common methods for developing. It's also much simpler. I printed out the xAPI spec. It's about 70 pages. It's quite simple. When we implemented xAPI in our learning management system, we got it up and running in less than a week. Now SCORM, if we had developed our own engine, would have taken about 2 years, was our development team's effort. So a simple spec is better, it's easier to get up and running. Recently, I decided that in our LMS, I wanted our blog pages, if you read the blog, I wanted you to be able to hit a button and it would write to the Learning Record Store. It took me 15 minutes to put that into the blog page because it's just so easy to do. It's much, much simpler than SCORM. I don't think I could have even done it with SCORM. Just much easier spec to understand. xAPI is also very flexible. You can make up your own verbs. An xAPI statement is, I did this. You can think of Facebook. You go into Facebook and you like a picture. Well, Chad likes his own picture.
I do. Art's turned me into a narcissist here.
I'm gonna leave that one. It didn't take. It's Chad is the actor, the verb is liked, and his picture is the object. That's an xAPI statement right there. And they can get a lot more complicated than that, but that's the basics. So you can define your own verbs in xAPI. You can use verbs that are specific to your industry. You might have industry groups that get together and say, these are the verbs we're going to use. You can define your own extensions if you want to track additional data. For example, in our annotator app, we track what browser you were in if you're making annotations in the browser. Or we can tell if you were on an iPad because that's also written into the extensions. So we know what time you made the statement, where you were when you made the statement, if you wanted to track geolocation, and what device you were on when you made the statement. All of that can be put into xAPI, and it can't be done in SCORM. That's good. Flexibility is great because in SCORM, if you wanted to track extra data, you're out of luck. You get what the spec says. You can't write extra variables and extra data to your SCORM engine. You can only write what's already there. Well, this is great that xAPI can do this, but from a LMS perspective, if you wanted to have credit in the LMS, this is not good. Because if I'm looking at an xAPI statement coming across, I'm the LMS, and I'm like, well, does completed mean that they finished it, or experienced, or what verb tells me that the person completed successfully the module I'm looking at? Is there a score? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't in the xAPI statement. There is a place to record results. But everybody implements it differently because there's no specification on how xAPI will be used with an LMS. So, xAPI, again, is just a communication layer. The LMS is not mentioned in the xAPI spec. It's just not there at all. It's purely a learning record store, not a learning management system. And I mentioned earlier, all these SCORM features are not included: sequencing, bookmarking, and most importantly, completion criteria. And then the last statement on why xAPI is not SCORM. This is from Aaron Silvers, who I think most people kind of consider the father of xAPI, or the godfather of xAPI, or at least the steward of xAPI. He led this through the committee at ADL and promotes it, and promoted it to everybody, got it adopted by ADL. And he says this is not the new SCORM, so we need something else. And in this statement, you can see that CMI5 is what they consider the way, the next generation of SCORM. So what is CMI5? Well, it's the use case for xAPI in the LMS world. So it's the way an LMS can use xAPI to communicate with content and get results back, just like it was SCORM, but with all of the advantages that xAPI brings to the table. It is intended to replace SCORM, although there is an effort at ADL undergo to directly map SCORM onto xAPI, and there is a wrapper available where you can take SCORM content and have it write xAPI statements. But basically, you're just replicating what SCORM does. You're not getting any of the advantages of what xAPI brings to the table. And even ADL is not really promoting that very much. CMI5 is a spec built on top of xAPI. So we assume that you've already got xAPI in place, you've got the communication going, you've got a learning record store somewhere. Could be in your LMS, or it could actually be external to your LMS. It just depends on how your LMS chooses to implement it. And then we've added some rules and said that this is what we're going to consider complete. This is how we're going to launch data. This is how the AU must communicate with the LMS. You can still do other things. You can make general xAPI statements from your content to track any data that you want. But if you want to be CMI5 compliant, there's certain rules you have to follow in order for the LMS to launch you and give credit for completion of the xAPI module. Our goals were to get back the interoperability that we had with SCORM, so that if we take content from one LMS to another, we want to be able to be sure we get the same results every time, and that they're all acting in a consistent manner. We want extensibility. We want you to be able to make any xAPI statements that you want, track any data about the user's experience that you want, but use our verbs when you want the LMS to give you credit for completing the xAPI course. And then we've also added mobile support, because xAPI has mobile support. CMI5, just being a spec on top of xAPI, and rules about how you use xAPI, will also have mobile support. Now here's a sample of our rules. These are the only 10 verbs that CMI5 cares about. Some of them are generated by the LMS. For example, when the LMS launches CMI5 course, it actually writes to the LRS a launched statement. When the AU comes up, the assignable unit, which is e-learning content, we're just using old AICC terms, it writes an initialized statement that says, I'm open and I'm ready for interaction with the user. There's a suspended, which means the user has decided to abandon it, and it gets bookmarked, of course, just like in SCORM. There's a resumed, so we can see when they left, when they came back. Completed, meaning that they read all the material. It may or may not mean that they actually completed the module and can move on to the next module. I'll come to that in a minute. Passed, failed, abandoned. This is determined by the LMS that if you launch an AU and you don't come back to it,
It's like being expired.
yeah, it is like expired. But it's based on rules in the LMS. So the LMS can implement any means of doing an abandon that it wants to implement. Generally, it would probably be best to leave that up to the administrator of the system to define those rules. There's a new waived item, which means that if you've completed this module, you can actually get waived on several other modules. So there's a kind of sequencing, a very rudimentary sequencing, that maybe if you pass the pre-test module, then you can skip 3 or 4 lessons and move on to an AU further down the road in the sequence. And then there's a terminated. Every module will finish with a terminated statement, which in AICC terms would have been exit AU, meaning that the module is now shut down, it's closed, and no longer taking interactivity. But in addition to these verbs, as I mentioned, the content, the xAPI content, can make any statement that it wishes. And it all has to be recorded based on xAPI rules in the Learning Record Store. So you could be CMI5 compliant and yet extend it and go track as much data as you want to track in the Learning Record Store. It's just that CMI5 will basically ignore those statements. It will write them to the LRS and track them for you, but it doesn't mean anything in terms of getting credit in the learning management system. Some of the structure of CMI5 that we've added on top of xAPI is there is a course structure file. It's sort of like the LMS manifest in the SCORM world, where we define what the content is, what the list of modules is going to be, what the passing criteria is, like is there a mastery score that we're going to compare to the score in the module, and it also defines the completion criteria. It's then imported, just like SCORM, into the learning management system. But it may or may not include content. In SCORM, the content and the manifest or the structure are all in one zip file. In CMI5, the content can be anywhere. So it can reside on a content distribution network, it can reside on your web servers. It doesn't have to be in the same domain as the LMS. So if you include content in the course structure that you give to the LMS, it means go ahead and store this just like SCORM on the LMS server. If you don't include content and you have external references, that's fine. CMI5 will work that way. Doesn't care where the content resides.
Hey, Art. So that's kind of cool because you can actually link out to MOOCs, external webinars, other recordings, lynda.com tutorial. I mean, like lots of repositories of content that you don't really necessarily own or control.
Or a mobile app.
Or a mobile app, yeah.
Which means that that content would come up in a window that the learner could then click through, and then when they're done, when they close that window, the information is transmitted back to the LRC?
LRS, yeah.
LRS?
Yeah, when the content gets opened up, it's actually writing statements to an LRS,
Okay.
and then the LMS is reading those back out. So the LRS sort of becomes the old file-based communication mechanism, but it's on the internet. And as Chad mentioned, the content can really be anything. It can be any URL if you want to send them to a website and it's sending xAPI statements, or it could be a mobile app, because you can actually launch a mobile app using what looks kind of like a URL, and your iPad sees it, or your Android tablet, and says, oh, I know what that is, and it opens up the app instead of the web location. The course structure has to be designed under CMI5 to support one or more assignable units. In fact, in the test suite, we've said it must be tested with at least 1,000 assignable units, which is kind of high. But essentially, if you can support more than one, you can support 1,000. It's not really any different. This is actually targeted at some systems that only support one course equals one content module. The CMI5 committee does not agree with that. So we're requiring that one course support multiple assignable units. And you just mentioned the launch mechanism. This is kind of interesting, that you can launch in the content file, in the course structure file, you specify, is it to be opened in any window that I want as the LMS, or does that content require its own window? So in SCORM, you might think it's always own window, because you never see content launched in the same window in SCORM. You always get at least two. You get the course, and then you get the LMS lying underneath it, listening to the course. Now, in most cases, content vendors have actually in SCORM gone with three windows, where you've got the LMS, you have the LMS listener window, and then the content opens up in a third window. And if your user inadvertently closes that listener window, they don't get credit, because nothing is ever going back to the LMS. So we're trying to get rid of that. We're trying to get rid of that multiple window approach. Not only is it ugly in a desktop browser, it's really bad in mobile to be opening up multiple windows. So if it says any window, there is a mechanism in CMI5 for us to launch the content in the same window. So the LMS is open, you launch something, the LMS goes away and is replaced by the content, so we only have one window. Great for mobile. Then when the content is done, it calls the LMS back and it comes back forward and says, okay, you finished with that module. So there is a mechanism in CMI5 for those two to interoperate in the same window. There's a concept of content entitlement. If you buy courses, you may get an entitlement key, which means when we launch that content, which again can be on a third-party website, doesn't have to be on the LMS site, we pass that key so it knows that you've paid for the content. There's also a capacity in CMI5 for you to be charged for the content, where you could actually launch, say, a PayPal site, get an entitlement key from PayPal, and then that would forward you onto the content with your entitlement key. So we built that in. CMI5 has session tracking. This is a lot like bookmarking in the SCORM world, where there's in xAPI, there's something called the state API, which is where you write all the current state data. And CMI5 takes advantage of that, and we use the LRS's state to record data about your session. But you can add any elements you want to that state. Again, it's all very flexible, provided you put at least what CMI5 requires you to put. This is something that I was very passionate about on the committee. Move-on criteria is something I added to the spec. In SCORM, there's a lot of times you'll get a module and the vendor says it should give credit and it's not giving credit in the LMS. You wonder why, and you go back and forth between the LMS vendor and the content, and they're arguing over it. Well, there's some inconsistencies in the SCORM spec about when you give credit. Does completed mean credit? Does passed mean credit? Or do you have to get both? So it just depends on how that's interpreted. We're getting rid of that interpretation in CMI5, and it will be specified in the course structure what you want to get in order to receive credit. So it could be that I get a past verb. And if you get past, that's all I need. Done. It could be that you get a completed verb. I get a completed verb, I'm done with that module and move on to the next one. Or it could be both. So the AU and the course vendor can specify what the completion criteria is. So we're getting rid of that ambiguity and making it very, very clear what will give you credit to move on to the next lesson. There is also a mastery score that must be respected in CMI5. You may find this as well in SCORM modules, that you want it to be 100%, but the course developer thought it should be 80%. And so it's sending back credit, yet the person only got an 80. We're removing that ambiguity, and in the course structure itself, it will have a mastery score, and the content is specifically prohibited in the spec from providing completion criteria if they don't at least meet the mastery score. So if a content module sends me a past and the score is less than the mastery score, it just violated the spec. It's against the rules.
So you're saying the LMS can overwrite the content mastery requirement?
Yes.
Only above it or below it?
It can go below it.
So if the content is saying it must be required at 80% and the LMS wants to pass at 50%, that can work?
Yes.
That becomes problematic with compliance elements.
Well, the LMS administrator is specifying it because the course structure is must be editable
That's set up in
by definition in the LMS. So if you're the administrator of the system, you can go in and put it whatever mastery score you want it to be. So then it becomes the administrator's decision not the content's decision.
In my scenario, that would mean we would never be able to offer content that way, and OSHA would change their rules in terms of allowing third-party LMSs.
Well, you would, if you always need 100%, you just set your mastery score to 100%.
But if in fact you're saying that the LMS can set a mastery score lower than what the content requires, so if the content's saying 80%,
The administrator of the LMS can. The LMS is not making this rule up. It would be whoever is running your system.
of the LMS, which is a client, which is then they can overrule what OSHA is requiring happens.
Yes, then they're going to get
Right.
fined.
So
Yeah,
actually, what
I'm in the compliance business, so I know how that
right.
works.
Well, actually, what happens is OSHA goes, okay, you can't deliver content through third-party LMS anymore. That's what they've done previously.
Well, the other option is the LMS doesn't allow editing of that, or you have a security rule for that on who can and who cannot change it.
Yeah.
We're not overruling LMSs or AUs in this rule. We're trying to give control to the users or the administrators. But through security, I can take away your ability to modify that field. Okay, what's good about CMI5? What are the benefits? Well, one of the things that's kind of cool is you can have content-defined data stored in the LRS. For example, right now, maybe you have a requirement that students go out and as part of the training they take a video of something, or they video themselves doing a procedure. Well, in SCORM, there's no way to record that, but in xAPI there is. Video can actually be recorded as part of a statement. Data sharing across content using an LRS. This means, I'll look at an example this minute, but it means lesson 1 or lesson 3 can actually fetch data that occurred in lesson 1. You can't do that with SCORM, but you can with CMI5. The content-defined launch mechanism I've kind of already covered. Everybody hates all those SCORM windows, and they're an accident waiting to happen when a user accidentally closes one. And distributed content, we've covered a little bit. Mobile device support. Use case. You build a content module, like I said, and you want to record video. Well, it's possible you could customize your LMS to allow uploading that video and storing the content. But with an LRS, you can already do that. You can write statements that include any kind of attachments, pictures, video, documents. So CMI5 adds this feature natively, the ability to store any kind of media with the statement. Data sharing, this is an example I just gave where you've got a series of lessons where one of the lessons depends on an exercise you took in the first part of the course. We've all kind of seen this, right? When you're taking a course and you add a student in row 1 or you add a record in the first lesson, and then later on you have to go back in and learn how to modify that record. Well, there's no way now for a SCORM module to go find out data that occurred in another SCORM module. Each one operates independently, and they don't have any authority to go look at what was done previously. With CMI5, they can. All they have to do is fetch the statements that they've written previously to the LRS, and that's part of xAPI. You have to have the ability to fetch. That's one of the rules. So we get that ability natively with CMI5. I've mentioned this several times. We all hate the multiple window approach. With CMI5, you can get rid of it. Distributed content. This is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. I don't know what's happened lately, but I have noticed an absolute trend in the last year that SCORM files are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It wasn't probably 2 years ago when we had a 20 meg limit on content that you could import into our SCORM engine. No other reason than bandwidth. It can handle bigger, but we just limited it to 20 meg. And we've had that for 7 or 8 years, the entire time we've had a built-in SCORM engine. All of a sudden, that wasn't enough. I don't know what happened. Maybe it's more video was being included, bigger pictures, less emphasis on control of your bandwidth. But we have had to up that number And we are now routinely getting SCORM modules that are 2004 version of SCORM that are over 200, 250 meg. Really big, and that's zipped. If you're designing courses like that, please reconsider. Your student is probably not getting a great performance experience, but it is happening, and we are seeing more and more large modules. Well, without CMI5, all of that stuff is being launched from here. Our web servers are in Houston in a data center on the other side of town, and if a guy is in Australia and he's downloading a 200 meg video, it's streaming all across the world. I always use Australia as an example because for some reason they have really bad bandwidth in Australia. It's like they ran one little wire out to the sea. And we routinely have problems. But with CMI5, that video could have been distributed. I could put it on a server in Australia, and the guy running it would get it local and not have to go out through that little bitty wire running across the channel to Indonesia and then up to Singapore. So CMI5 is great for distributed content. SCORM is terrible for distributed content. And mobile support. xAPI, just out of the box, is much better in a mobile world because of the way it sends statements, and it doesn't require launching from a browser window and all of that. So you just get this technology inherently when you use xAPI as the basis for your spec. Okay, where are we now? The CMI5 has not been released. It is very, very close. Next week, I'll be in Alexandria, Virginia, as we finalize the spec. We're having a 2-day meeting. We got tired of these 1-hour-a-week meetings, and we're all going to fly into Alexandria and have 2 days of intense completion of the spec. It's essentially finished. We're going through and we're finding bugs in the spec, we're finding typos, invalid references, and so on. And then we're going to develop a bunch of use cases and say, okay, in this case, how would this spec handle this? What verbs would be used? What content would be used? Where would the content be? Does the spec handle that? And then after this meeting, we will be announcing, hopefully, the spec is available for public comment. It's actually available now. You can find it on the web. I'll give you the address. And you can read through it. It's very short. The whole spec is like 10 pages. It's very simple to understand, short spec. And then our goal is that sometime later this year, after a period of public comment, it will be released as official ADL specification. If you want to come to this meeting, it's free. If you don't want to fly to Alexandria, there is actually going to be webinars on both days, on the 15th and 16th. On the 15th, at 11 in the morning, I think it's a 2-hour webinar. They're going to present what is the spec, what is the current status of the spec, basically a lot of what you just heard here, but in more detail. We'll be there.
Sorry, is that East Coast or Central Time?
That is Central Time.
I'm thinking on my calendar.
Yeah, let me look that up before you do that. I have it on my phone. I'll verify that. And then the next day, we're going to be repeating a little bit of that, but we're also going to be telling you what we accomplished the previous day. So if you're not used to that, and there will be a period for people to comment during that webinar as well. And this is just a little bit of credit. I stole a lot of this from Bill McDonald at Boeing Flight Services. Bill is our fearless leader of the spec. And Bill goes all the way back to the AICC days. He was a committee member for the original AICC back in 1993. So he has a lot of experience with spec development. Lastly, I've got some resources. I think Debbie has the slide deck, so it's available wherever all this will be posted. But there's the spec itself, that's the address. It's currently still under AICC. It will be moving to an ADL post, but ADL officially took it over in December, and they just haven't moved it yet. Your government at work. There's an overview in this blog, which is essentially what I just presented, because I wrote the blog. And then this is the note where ADL and AICC get together on it. And this is the actual xAPI specification. It's a little bit more complex than the CMI5 spec, but if you want some good reading to put yourself to sleep, you can go read the xAPI spec. And thanks for attending, and I was going to open it up for any questions anybody might have.
Can you take just one step back and tell me why we moved from AICC to SCORM? What was the main reason?
The primary driver was that the Department of Defense didn't feel like they were getting enough granular data from AICC. AICC is primarily a score and completion spec, where I can launch content and I can get a result back. SCORM has some things that AICC doesn't have. It has much more granular data. I can record, for example, the score on every test question,
Right.
Which you could kind of do with AICC, but it's much more vague, and it's not standardized very well. SCORM also has sequencing rules, which AICC has no sequencing rules at all.
And SCORM sets the groundwork for the concept of a shareable content object, something that can be moved from one system to another transparently without compatibility issues.
Theoretically, AICC should have done that too, but because there was some vagueness in the spec, it doesn't always work that way.
Well, in AICC, you would take care of sequencing with the PRE file, the prerequisites file, right?
You could, but it was very limited.
And so in the new setup, how would the multiple AU setup be controlled by?
In the course
prerequisites?
structure,
Course structure?
it's handled in the course structure. There's AUs, and then there's also blocks of AUs. And you can set a move-on criteria that actually skips an entire block. So you can either be in a block and skip 2 lessons and go further down to 2 AUs, or you can be in a block and maybe pass the first lesson and skip the whole rest of the block and go to the next block. You can even jump 2 or 3 blocks further down.
What do you do if you don't want any jumping, but you have to do something in a particular order?
Then it would just be in the course structure itself. By default, it's going to execute in the structure that it's imported from the XML file. It's called CMI5.xml.
So today, the metrics that we look at from SCORM are number of participants and training hours. What kind of metrics would we see from the xAPI?
Well, there's still hours is part of the spec, but a lot of that is left up to you because we've allowed for the extension capability in xAPI. So I think there's going to be a lot of things that people are tracking. The hours and the results are built in, but everything else is left open. And of course, with individual xAPI statements, outside of CMI5, you could record individual test question results if you wanted to. You could record page views. So maybe somebody can take a different path through your content, and each path can be recorded because you can have xAPI statements that say, user hit page 3, user hit page 6, user hit page 7. User spent 2 minutes on page 7. That's capable possibility of the spec. We actually tried very hard not to have a lot of pre-specified data in CMI5 to make it flexible. In fact, the verb list has been culled down tremendously. There's a lot of arguing to minimize the spec.
You want to keep it simple.
Simple. Simple yet flexible. So you can do whatever you want, and we're imposing as few rules as we possibly can to get a completion. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm very new to doing all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Keeping that in mind, what suggestions would you make for me in terms of getting up to speed on the basics?
Okay, you're developing content?
I'm trying to learn more and more about this whole process, this piece. And so the way my brain works, I have a certain desire, I have a real need to understand the basic terminology, the concepts behind it, that kind of thing. Once I grasp that, I usually can move forward pretty quickly. But
Okay.
in order to do that,
The difficulty in coming with an explanation for that is that SCORM is so darn complicated. I would never send anybody to read SCORM spec.
right.
I've read it, I don't understand it, and I've been working with it for 15 years.
Okay, I'll scratch that.
I think it would be helpful to understand the xAPI spec and what it does. I gave a blog reference earlier from my CMI5 blog, I've also got one out there. On our website, there's a topic called xAPI and CMI5, and if you look at that, there's several articles in xAPI that are introductions. They're good enough they're being quoted in other articles and other presentations. So hopefully they're a good introduction. And then from there, I would actually look at the spec itself. The xAPI spec is a bit technical, but not extremely so. It's not like SCORM where you have to be an absolute programmer to be able to understand it. But I think between the blog articles and the spec, you can get a pretty good idea of what xAPI is. Chad, you got any idea about SCORM?
Where to go to learn about SCORM?
Maybe the ADL website?
Yeah, adlnet.gov has quite a few resources, no doubt. SCORM.com, which is Rusticy's site, there's a lot of educational material there as well.
Yeah. SCORM.com is actually owned by a vendor, but they make a SCORM engine, and they're the ones who helped develop xAPI for the government. They're the ones that were contracted to do it. There's also tincanapi.com, which is a good overview of xAPI. They actually have a really good white paper out there called Layers of the Tin Can Onion. And it starts with the really top level of active-verb object, and then it starts digging down into, well, you know, you could really track all this other data too, and if you do that, you can report on this other data, and you can go one layer deeper. And it's a pretty easy-to-read white paper. In fact, we usually hand it out at trade shows, even though it's not our document. Just because it's so well done. Those are resources I would suggest. SCORM, I would just try to get an overview from the ADL website. It's far too complicated for most people to get a really good grasp. And to be frank, most people really use very little of SCORM. They're using it a lot more like AICC, just getting a completion.
Right. Yeah.
You know, we have people come to us at trade shows and say, well, you SCORM compliant? Yeah. What are you wanting to get out of SCORM? I don't know. I was told I had to have it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
In which case, I would probably say go with AICC because you don't need the complexity of SCORM if that's all you're trying to do. AICC is much easier.
I would say if you go to SCORM.com /SCORM-explain, there's a synopsis there and also a video. Just search SCORM explain. You'll take you straight to
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Will this be available with Optimus tools? Like that?
I certainly hope so. Today, no, because it hasn't been published, but hopefully once it's been published, it will be adopted with ADL backing it and so on. Now, there are authoring tools now that do a little bit of xAPI work, so
Were you able to do updates?
they're not great.
Let's do updates.
Yeah, the authoring tools will definitely have to be updated. However, if they're already xAPI compliant, then doing the additional step to do CMI5 should be really easy, and we did that on purpose. We tried to say, if you're already xAPI compliant and you're an authoring tool, it should be a very small step to go forward and be CMI5. All we're doing is saying, you need to use these verbs, and you need to have this course structure. And if you do, you're CMI5 compliant.
So if LMS is SCORM compliant and you create content according to CMI5, should you run into any trouble with an implementation of content into LMS? Do the LMSs have to adjust anything?
The LMSs actually have more work to do than the content developers for CMI5 because LMSs, especially if they don't have a built-in LRS, they're going to have to figure out how to read from an LRS. Now, it's easy. As I mentioned earlier, I got one working in 10 minutes using a free toolkit that Rusticy publishes. So the LMSs are going to be more difficult to get them to come along, just like they have with xAPI, than content vendors. Content vendors have it easy in this spec. As long as they're already xAPI, it's easy for them. LMSs have to learn how to read and write from an LRS.
And there's a mindset shift that occurs too, right? Because the LMS previously talk about a course module, how many statements get issued from a learner's experience or interaction with that, back to the LMS. 3, 5 at the most? How many? And when you talk about a full, robust implementation of something like xAPI or CMI5, you could be talking about analytics type of events where it's in-page activity. Somebody clicked on this, somebody looked at this, somebody scrolled over this, someone panned over this particular image. I mean, a learning interaction could potentially be issuing dozens of statements.
It turns into big data instead
Absolutely.
The minor.
Yeah.
of really simple metrics.
xAPI is almost always going to lead to big data.
So if you, would you have any advice for content creators that obviously would like to go to the endpoint of being able to offer that data, but know that they're going to be dealing with LMSs that are in transition for a period of time?
Well,
Is there a good strategic approach where you're not going to be cut out from being able to go into an LMS that's having problems?
I would have, if it were me, I'm not a content developer, I would have the ability to write xAPI statements as soon as possible, if you don't, and have it be turn-onable. Like in our LMS, we have a configuration property that says I'm using an LRS or I'm not using an LRS, and if you're using the LRS, we start writing statements to it. If you're not, we just track it in the traditional way in the LMS. And you can do the same thing in a content tool. You can say, what's your LRS endpoint? And if you don't get one, then you know you can't send xAPI statements and you're resolved to sending traditional SCORM data. But you can ask that of the developer up front. Are you going to have an endpoint or not? Yes, sir.
So I imagine that you guys would be, one of the first ones to get CMI5 on your LMS, but what do you think for those of us that are or have been stuck with the big monsters that haven't even got to xAPI yet? You got any thought on how far down the road they're
Chad and I were just at xAPI camp run by Aaron Silvers down in Orlando. And there will be another one at DevLearn if you're interested at all in xAPI and CMI5. The day before DevLearn, as part of the e-learning guild thing in Vegas in, Duncan, is it September, October?
September this year.
September, first week?
Yeah, it's the 30th of September to do the second.
Yeah. One of the big pushes and challenges in the room, we're trying to figure out how to move xAPI forward, is to get the LMS vendors on board. As Chad mentioned in his presentation this morning, the small and agile ones have jumped on it. The bigger ones, unless they're pushed by their clients, they're not going to. And you see the same thing in some of the content tools. I won't mention them by name, Adobe, but they were really, really, really slow to adopt xAPI because they said, well, we've already got SCORM, why do we need xAPI? They just didn't want to address the challenge. But the only way that's going to move forward is if customers of big LMSs push them and say, you need to do this. I can't do it. They don't give a crap what I think. It's just such an obvious benefit. I don't understand why they don't want to do it. And frankly, it's not hard. They don't even have to build an LRS in. They could just integrate with an existing LRS, like Saltbox has an LRS-only product called Wax. Rusticy has one called Watershed. There's a free one out there called Learning Locker from Ben Betts. ADL has one on their website. Theirs is really hard to set up.
Yeah, it is.
But instead of using ADLs, I would go with Learning Locker, which is free. So you can actually start tracking this data if you want, as long as you have something that can generate xAPI statements, and just put in your own LRS.
Yeah. I mean, xAPI has something on its side, and that is that if the LMS vendor and the tool vendor want to be purchasable by government training departments, DoD and otherwise, which they're the largest consumers of training in the entire world, if you want to be able to sell your product to DoD, your product has to be xAPI compatible. It has to be. And I don't know if CMI5 has that kind of stick that they can wave around or anything like that.
Well, it's being funded by ADL, which is part of the Department of Defense. So, will CMI5 start showing up on RFPs from the Department of Defense? My expectation is yes, it will. They're not pushing this standard because they think it's fun. They're wanting to see xAPI integrated into LMSs. So ultimately, the push from the DoD will probably bring everybody along with push from customers like yourselves. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just interested in your thoughts on if we are adopting the CMI5 standard for a new tool and it needs to integrate and talk to SCORM compliant. What's the backwards compatibility process like?
There's no connection between SCORM and CMI5 in the old world. Now there is, as I said, there are toolkits out there. ADL has one that will let you write xAPI statements from a SCORM module. Basically, all you're doing is replicating SCORM data, and to me, it's just a waste of time. You're collecting a bunch of data you're never going to use. So CMI5 and SCORM, in terms of their technology, are 100% different. There's just no relationship between the two. So again, if you're looking for ultimate CMI5 compatibility, the trick is to go xAPI compatibility, and then it's a real easy add-on to add CMI5.
So how do you think those of us in the room who want to get rid of SCORM can best do that?
Push your LMS.
Module by module. As you're publishing new content, you publish it as CMI5.
Well, and then the question is, does everything have to be in your LMS? You know, I'm an LMS provider, and I'm the first one to stand up and say absolutely not. You know, I buy into the 70-20-10 or the 70-30 rule. That there's a lot of learning that's occurring right now that is not going to be in your LMS. That's why I dove in and was an early adopter. You know, they called me about xAPI 5 and said, "Do you want to participate?" Hell yes, I want to participate. So we jumped right in because we know that kind of learning is going on, and we need to capture it. So you can have an LRS now and not integrate it with your LMS. That's perfectly fine. You just may have to find a way to report from both. And it's fairly easy to fetch data out of an LRS because it's required as part of the spec. There's a very standard way to do it. In fact, I just wrote a program that fetched statements from an LRS, fixed them because we had a bug, and then wrote them all back. And it took me a couple of hours to write that. It's very easy to write stuff that fetches from an LRS. There's a lot of libraries that are free that will let you do this. Float has one for iPad, right?
That's correct.
Rusticy has on their website, Tin Can API, they have .NET libraries, they have PHP libraries, they have Java libraries, they have JavaScript libraries, and they're all free.
Yeah, they have an iOS library as well, but theirs isn't as good as ours.
Yeah. Clearly. So if you're developing on any of those platforms, you can get an xAPI library now. And there are some content development tools that do write to an LRS. Storyline is one. I don't like the way they're doing it. That's totally personal opinion. I know some people using it, but basically they're replicating SCORM.
Yeah.
And I don't see any benefit of that.
And they have some compatibility issues between 0.9 spec LRSs and 1.0
yes,
spec.
they're not.
issues.
They're not 1.0, so they're not really current spec. Lectora Publisher can write xAPI statements.
Adobe Captivate can now too.
But are they SCORM or are they your own statements?
It's still basically a SCORM statement being sent to an LRS.
Well, you were telling me another one yesterday at dinner.
It's possible. I'm trying to recall the other vendors.
You know, you had some martinis for you.
Do you know what version Lectora? They have 12?
I don't know the version. I don't know the current version number.
Current version of Lectora?
12 sounds about right.
Captivate would be 8.
Yes. And they are nearing release on another
A new
update.
version.
Mhm.
The advantage I've heard of Lectora is that you have the flexibility to control kind of what statements are going out instead of just replicating SCORM.
That's pretty cool.
Would be the cloud one.
And you know, you can always use the JavaScript library. If your tool has the ability to plug in JavaScript, you can use the Rusticy JavaScript library to get xAPI statements with it. But the bottom line answer to your question, and really your question as well, is get xAPI compliant, and then the rest will come easier. And then if you have an LMS and it's not compliant, push them. You're the only ones that can.
Yeah.
If they're not responsive to you, find a vendor that is. Somebody's going to get in there and do it.
In your experience, both of you and whoever else, with other clients that are doing any xAPI stuff, what's the, I guess I see all the, SCORM 2004, oh, we can track everything on all the questions answered and everything. It's like, yeah, but nobody's ever looking at it. I'm trying to think how much data is just being stored for data's sake that they'll never look at versus,
Yeah.
or data that we think they'll look at and we're not capturing data that they eventually will want?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. There is a strategy that you need to define when you start using xAPI because it will be big data. In our example, looking at the annotator again, we knew exactly what we were going to write, what we were going to capture, and that we knew what the reports would look like before we implemented this. Now, we implemented the annotator, and we're just now implementing the reports, but we knew what data we were capturing, and we designed it to capture data that we could report. There's at the first MLearn, where there were people demonstrating xAPI projects, there's a guy from DOD who came in, and they had a simulator that would store ammunition. So you had a forklift, and you were supposed to store it in one of 3 warehouses. And if you stored it in the wrong warehouse, it blew up, because apparently you can't store certain kinds of ammunition near other kinds of ammunition. I had no idea about this. It's not my area of expertise. And he was tracking every turn of the forklift, like this, every single movement, every single acceleration, backing it up. If they thought they might be going into the wrong one and were going to blow up. And he blew up his LRS in about 5 minutes of presentation because he was tracking so much data. And then he had to go back and rewrite it and say, really, I only need to know where they ultimately put it. I don't need to track every left and right turn going in. So you have to make those kind of decisions with xAPI because it is big data, and you better know what you're going to report on before you start writing to it, or you're going to end up with a mess.
There are database formats, though, that are made for that. So most learning management systems are using an SQL-style database, right, which is really great for a lot of read operations and a lot of great ways that you can join data and find, relational information via a traditional structured query language database query, right? The way that xAPI has really been generated with the RESTful API and the amount of traffic and information, it lends itself to a NoSQL database approach, or MongoDB, or some other sort of what I would consider a really modern approach to database. And I know you have feelings about NoSQL databases via SQL databases, but we do live in a post-SQL world, and big businesses like Twitter and things like that are making a very strong case for these unstructured databases because of the fact that there are so many read, write, and query operations that are occurring, synchronous writes, etc., right? So blowing up the LMS, that's very easy to do with an SQL kind of world that we had been living in. But in a NoSQL world, especially on a database that's cloud, load balanced,
He was in
scalable.
a NoSQL database.
What was it?
Yeah.
He was not
It's a good
using.
theory.
He was not using load balancing.
No, he had SQL Server.
So, but related to David's root question would be, think about the decisions that you want to make and the recommendations that you want to be able to make to your organization, your enterprise, and then use that to then determine what sorts of insights would lead you to those decisions, right? And then from those insights, you can glean what information is going to provide that, and that leads you to the actual data that you need to capture. So it's basically the reverse of the normal chain in which you think data leads to information, information leads to insights, insights leads to recommendations and decisions.
There's also the possibility you may have multiple learning record stores. There are some that specialize in one kind of reporting, some that specialize in others. I know that in the Boeing world, for example, they're trying to design an LRS that's very specifically tailored to answering questions about flight simulation, because that's what they do. So they have to teach pilots how to fly, they have to track them in simulators, and they have to be able to report on them. So they're having an LRS just for that. And then they're going to have another one for other stuff. And this is actually our case, too, with our annotator. The statements that are going in are being reported by one system, but the other stuff that we're putting in is not part of that reporting engine. We're going to build a separate reporting engine because that one is very specific to the kind of statements we know coming in. So it's highly possible that lots of organizations are going to have multiple learning record stores that specialize in a certain kind of reporting.
Yeah.
And that's okay in the xAPI world because there is a built-in capability for one LRS to fetch data from another LRS to
Yeah.
replicate data.
And I think that there's also an opportunity in the marketplace for a business intelligence vendor, somebody like Tableau, to come in and build connectors or bridges for LRS vendors. So LRS vendors are going to be generating just piles and piles of data that can be queried via these, RESTful or JSON, and then you just pull it into Tableau. And Tableau is a data visualization tool. You can build your own custom reports, basically. I mean, it's not particularly easy. It requires some
Difficult though.
but it does require expertise.
Yeah, it does. It does require an analyst to
Yes.
develop all of
So if you've got a group that does have multiple LRSs, then the admin would have to specify which posting point, depending on which types of, if you have multiple types of data being tracked in something, you would then have to be able to direct it to different points.
Yeah, typically what I would see happening actually is there would be one core LRS that had all the data, and then the other LRSs would fetch
Parses it
from
out
it
for-
based on the kind of statements that they needed.
Yeah, that's good.
And that is part of the spec, that I can say, I want these kinds of statements to come into this LRS and go fetch them from that LRS.
So you might use one for item analysis, another one for video analysis of uploaded examples of them testing out
Exactly.
something.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
For some of us who have not gone this far, if we implement xAPI and we have legacy data that's not SCORM compliant, do we have a problem? Is there a way of handling that to bring the data in for people who are still going to be in the database so that we have some history on them?
Well, if you want to put that data into an LRS, you'd have to write an application that would fetch that data from your legacy system and then write it to the LRS. That's not as difficult as it would sound. I mean, if you've got an SQL database and you know that you've got test answers somewhere and you want to write them to the LRS, that's a pretty small application to do that. It's not really a lot of work.
So it's a one-time.
It's probably a one-time extract, and then if your test generated from then on is writing to the LRS, you don't have to worry about any future data. All right, well, thank you very much. That was a lot of fun.
Art, we want to thank you for being with us this afternoon. Art has a booth out here. Be sure and stop by and ask any more questions that you might have. And in appreciation for being here, we would like to give you this wonderful plaque.
Well, thank you very much. To go on the wall.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Art?